Good morning, everyone. The human body exchanges heat with the environment in many ways, as we show here in this picture. We have radiation, solar radiation coming from the sun, a lot of it when we're not shaded. And there's also reflected radiation coming from the ground and all the objects around us. We're also producing a lot of internal heat, mainly through metabolism and primarily in the exercising muscles. And we have to find a way to balance this, otherwise there are problems, as we will see. The system that does this, is taking care of this balance, is called thermoregulatory system, and it has two main branches. The autonomic or endocrine branch, which has to do with adaptations such as sweating and shivering, as we will see in a bit, and also the behavioral part, which has to do with our conscious decisions to change our thermal balance. So for example, removing clothes when we're hot, or adding clothes, or finding a shade when it's really hot. So this has to do with conscious behaviors. And we're going to review these today, this morning, as an introduction to the rest of the talks that will follow later on. So if we are to describe thermoregulation in the heat in one single slide, this is more or less how we describe the thermoregulatory system. Based on the available knowledge at the moment, what we believe that is the center of the thermoregulatory system is in the brain, in the preoptic anterior hypothalamus, which is the initials here. This receives signals from the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord temperature, and also receives signals from the peripheral nervous system from peripheral thermosensors. These are two types. They assess skin temperature in the shell of the body, which is mainly affected by the environment. And these peripheral thermosensors also measure deep organ temperatures, so not spinal cord and brain, but also the visceral organs. And this is a good indicator of what happens when we exercise. So physical work and immune responses, also when we have fever, for example. These peripheral thermosensors send through afferent input information to the central nervous system, and this is integrated, all of this information is integrated into producing commands. And these commands either produce in the heat cutaneous vasodilation, so our vessels in the periphery get bigger, wider, and there's more blood in the shell. So we have vasodilated skin, and also we start sweating. And these responses lead to what we call the body temperature. So the result of this we see as a mean body temperature. And this comes back to the central nervous system as a negative feedback loop. And this keeps perpetuating, and this is how the body regulates heat balance when it's in the heat. And this is very nicely explained in this equation, which is called the heat balance equation, which is the metabolism and the work that we produce, which can be zero if we're just sitting, or can be very high if we're exercising. And this is radiative, conductive, and convective heat loss. And this is evaporative heat loss through sweating. So let's start with, I will describe the first part of the first branch of the thermoregulatory system, the autonomic one. The autonomic works with thermosensors, as we said, in the brain, the spinal cord, and the central organs. These are called transient receptor potential ion channels, or TRP channels. These are proteins that are expressed in pain and temperature sensitive neurons. There are about 30, and we can divide them, we can categorize them in 6 groups, 6 families, as we say, at least so far, because there's some more coming as time is going by. And what they do is their axons, the axons of these neurons, is projected to lamina 1. And then this, through the spinal cord, these signals are carried to the hypothalamus, the brainstem, and the insular cortex. When we are exposed in the cold, what happens is we try to conserve heat. So we have skin vasoconstriction. As you can see here, the skin there's a lot of less blood flow to the skin, and the blood stays, the majority of the blood stays in the core of the body to prevent heat loss. And also we start producing heat by shivering thermogenesis, and also non-shivering thermogenesis, as we have discussed in previous days, through brown adipose tissue. The combined response of all these mechanisms is first, as we mentioned here, reduce the rate of heat loss, so we reduce the amount of heat that we lose to the environment, and at the same time we increase the amount of metabolic heat production, which both result in what we hope to be a heat balance. So we produce as much as we lose, and therefore there's no change. What happens in the heat? The increases in skin or core temperature lead to adaptations to increase heat dissipation. We try to reduce, get rid of that heat by increasing peripheral vasodilation. So our vessels in the skin are increasing in diameter. There's a lot of blood flow in the periphery to radiate that heat to the environment. And also we have a lot of sweating to evaporate the sweat and again remove the excess heat. The combined, again, response here is that it increases the rate of heat loss to the environment, and as a result we're hoping that this is enough to maintain heat balance. Of course, there are cases, especially with intense exercise in the heat or intense work in the heat, where this is not enough, and as a result we do not have heat balance, as we will say in a bit. The important things to remember is that each of these responses is characterized by a threshold. The shivering doesn't start until a certain point. The sweating doesn't start until a certain point. So each response that we have has an onset threshold beyond which it starts increasing. So there's a switch at some point. And we could characterize it like this. So for example, here we have vasodilation or sweating. So as we go up on the vertical axis, vasodilation and sweating go up, and this is mean body temperature on the horizontal axis. So if we follow the black line, if someone starts getting hot and move along the horizontal axis, at some point their sweating will start increasing, and it will increase proportionally to the increase in mean body temperature. At some point, though, it will reach a plateau because we can only sweat to a certain extent. We can change that by, for example, acclimatization or acclimation. We can become more sensitive to heat. For example, we can start a lot earlier to sweat, and we can actually increase the amount of sweating that we can produce. So we can start a lot earlier to sweat and reach to the plateau or the maximum much faster and sooner, and therefore reduce the amount, increase the amount of heat that we lose to the environment. These are results from direct calorimetry, and this is what happens when we're exposed to heat. The dark line that you see here is metabolic heat production that stays the same. Sorry, this is evaporative heat loss that slowly, gradually is increasing. However, this is metabolic heat production that stays the same, but because when we enter a very hot environment, there's a lot of radiative heat coming from all the solid materials around us, and that, as a result, we're actually starting to get heat. Our body the net heat load is increasing because the dry heat exchange, we do not lose any heat through radiation. As a result, we're actually getting a lot hotter, and as you see, our evaporative mechanism is slowly increasing. It takes a while for sweat to start increasing. Therefore, we have what we call a net heat load. Therefore, our body is starting to become hotter and hotter. The point of all this is that by increasing the vasodilation across, what the body does is increasing the temperature of the skin. Therefore, the surrounding materials are not that hot anymore compared to our skin. Therefore, we minimize the amount of radiation heat that we absorb. This is the only thing that we can do through vasodilation. However, evaporation in this case is really important. Our vasodilation can help to reduce the amount of heat that we get from the environment, but it does not serve to actually get rid of the heat. The only way to do that is through evaporation. In compensable conditions, so when there's not a lot of humidity in the environment, or the metabolic heat production is not that high, this can actually is enough to maintain heat balance. And therefore the rate of heat storage, so the amount of heat that the body receives, in the end is 0. However, when we're wearing a lot of clothing, or some suits, for example, when we're working and we're wearing, for example, chemical protective clothing, or when wearing a uniform to protect ourselves, when we're exercising, for example, American football, they wear a lot of protective clothing. So in uncompensable conditions, this does not balance out. As a result, the body is continuously absorbing heat, and in the end, core temperature will increase. So, as I mentioned earlier, evaporation is the most important mechanism through which we actually manage to evaporate, to reduce heat storage. Especially, and this is particularly important during exercise, because with a single liter of sweat, we can actually remove around 600 kilocalories of heat energy. At rest, the most important mechanism for removing heat is radiation. However, when we're exercising, about 80%, when we are working, about 80% of the heat generated is actually lost through evaporation. And this is why when we have uncompensable conditions, when we are wearing uniforms, or when there's a lot of humidity in the environment, so therefore evaporation does not work, because there's a lot of humidity and therefore our sweat cannot evaporate, we have a severe limitation in removing heat, because this mechanism, which is really important during exercise, is actually hindered. And let's see from some data that we collected back in 2010 what happens when we're at rest in a hot environment. We had some subjects and we had them just sit and watch TV in a hot environment. And the top line here that you see is the heat production, and the bottom line is the heat loss. And as you can see, there's a little bit of gray there as soon as they enter, but after a while it actually balances out, so they stop getting more hot. So the difference between the two lines, the gray part, is actually heat being conserved in the body. However, when we asked them to exercise, and this is only 20 watts exercise, it's more or less like walking. They were cycling here, but the watts are really low. What happens is metabolic heat production starts to increase immediately because we're producing heat through exercise, but the heat loss mechanism takes a while to adapt to that. And as a result, we have a lot of conserved heat within our body. Towards the end of that hour, we're almost reaching equilibrium. But then again, we asked them at the end of the first hour to double the exercise intensity. And again, there was a jump in metabolic heat production, but there was a delay in evaporative heat loss. And therefore, again, they started conserving even more heat. So what happens at the beginning of work, heat production rises rapidly due to metabolic heat production and muscle activity. The mechanism of heat dissipation react with a lot of delay, significant delay, and as a result, temperature rises at the start of work. And if heat dissipation, like here or towards the end of each exercise bout, if heat dissipation matches heat production, there's no heat storage, and core temperature will actually stabilize. Usually what happens at work is when we're working, especially in hot environments, we don't work for 8 hours continuously. We work in bouts. So even for manual occupations, you would do some work and then you would stop for a bit, maybe to talk to someone or do something less heavy, and then you go back to work. So what we do a lot of times to simulate this is we do repetitive bouts of exercise. And this is a model that we often use. And these are results from a direct calorimeter. And here you see what happens when we during the first exercise bout. we have, as I mentioned before, a very fast increase in metabolic heat production, and the heat loss mechanism take a while to actually catch up. And they cannot actually catch up all the way up, so that we have a lot of heat storage. And when we rest, this is negative, therefore during rest we actually get rid of a lot of that heat. But look at what happens in the second bout. So that in the second bout, our heat dissipation mechanism react a lot faster, and they reach a higher level. Therefore, there's less heat actually being absorbed. And in the second bout of rest, the negative component here, the heat loss, is even more. So we actually get adapted to that. But there's always a little bit of plastic, at least in this case, because the intensity of exercise was high enough so that the people would actually never reach equilibrium. But this is what we call priming effect. So the more the exercise bouts, the less the heat storage. So this was a bit of an review about how autonomic or endocrine thermoregulation works. And it's important to remember that it has, as I mentioned there, a finite capacity. If I go one slide back, you will see that there is a certain amount of heat that we can actually get rid of. We cannot get rid of an infinite amount of heat. On the other hand, the behavioral part that we will talk about now has near infinite capacity. We can actually shield ourselves if we're really cold. We can start a fire. We can, or we can look for a shade, and we can turn on the air conditioning. So it has, this part has near infinite capacities. The thermal behavior, as we call it, takes different forms, and we can see it in all endothermic animals, all animals that actually are trying to maintain a near constant thermal homeostasis. For example, you can see here a fly that is opening its wings to get rid of heat, or it's actually looking for a shade, or some reptiles touch their bellies on a rock to get hot in the morning. Or evaporation in humans, and you know, animals are not really good in sweating. Most of them actually do not sweat, and but they use their tongues to evaporate heat, and that's why you see dogs panting all the time. And also, we eat to maintain our heat balance. Also, we've seen this is another behavioral mechanism because of the processes of digestion. They include metabolic processes, and as a result there is heat generated. Therefore, we also have a diet-induced thermogenesis, and it's used also as and we've seen it in animals as well and in humans. When they're cold, they will eat more. So how does this part of thermoregulation work? Again, it uses the receptors, the same receptors, but now the signals are analyzed in a different part of the brain. Again, we have these TRP ion channels, as I mentioned before, but as you can see here, except the hypothalamus and the brainstem, the signals from these proteins, these neurons, are conveyed also to the insular cortex. So the integration there in the insular cortex is integration of these signals produces what we call the feelings. So the insular cortex is the part of the brain that makes us feel things. For example, here you have the combined representation of feelings of hot and cold in this part of the brain, as you can see, and it's activated when someone is cooled here. So here again in this image you see the areas that are on the brain in the top part, areas of the brain that are activated when we are cooled, in this part of the brain, and in the second, in the bottom picture, areas of the brain then when we're really hot, when we touch something that is extremely hot. Again, we feel the subjective feeling is generated by this area. So, although the preoptic anterior hypothalamus, the center of thermoregulation in terms of autonomic responses, doesn't play any role in behavioral thermoregulation, the neural pathways that are important to behavioral thermoregulation have also little to do with triggering autonomic. So it's totally two separate components. These behavioral thermoregulation have nothing to do or little to do with actually making us shiver or making us sweat or increase vasodilation. So what we measure and what we experience in everyday life when we talk about behavioral thermoregulation. We talk about thermal comfort, which is essentially how indifferent we feel with the thermal environment around us. We also talk about thermal sensation, which is the relative intensity of what is the temperature. Do you really feel extremely hot or not? How intense is the feeling that you experience? And we also, as you will see in the following slides, we also talk about perceived exertion. Now, most people do not link this with thermoregulation, but in fact, it is an essential part of thermoregulation. So the subjective perception of effort, usually known as RPE, is part of behavioral thermoregulation, as I will show you. And this is why. What happens in cells is that, unfortunately, our cells cannot use all the energy in the micronutrients to produce ATP. A lot of it, the vast majority, is lost as heat energy to the surrounding cells and the surrounding tissues. At least 60%, sometimes up to 95% of the energy in the micronutrients is converted to heat energy. And we have to dissipate that. We have to get rid of this. And this is why during exercise we get really hot, because metabolism increases and therefore heat generation is increased. So therefore, for a worker to actually produce external work of 75 watts, in order to produce this work, they actually have to catabolize at least 500 watts of micronutrients, and the rest, the 425 approximate watts, are actually lost as heat within his body. And if he's wearing a protective uniform, he has to find a way to dissipate this external heat. For example, exercise studies have shown that even in cycling, which is considered the most economic, efficient physical task, where approximately 20% of the energy in the micronutrients actually goes on the pedal. And this is stationary cycling, it's not cycling outside in nature, in the field. What happens is, as you can see, it's 20%. Therefore, in order to actually put 100 watts on the pedal, we need to catabolize 500 watts, and the rest, 400, are actually lost as heat. And we have to find a way to dissipate this, because if we do not, core temperature will go up, as I mentioned earlier. And this will have, as a result, a reduction in performance. There is not a single study in the literature that hasn't shown that when we get hot, that our temperature does not go down. This is proven by many authors. So the point is, as a result, because our intensity of exercise is linked with how hot we are, this means that how we regulate our intensity is actually a result of how hot we feel. Therefore, that's why we say that changes in work intensity, so for example, if I'm running a marathon, the intensity at which I'm running is actually determined based on how hot I feel. So changes in work intensity affect thermoregulation, therefore we consider them as thermoregulatory behaviors. But several studies have tried to find out what is the basis, how do we regulate exercise or work intensity. For example, if I'm running a marathon, what makes me think I will reduce my pace? What makes me feel that? What makes me make this decision, this conscious decision? A very interesting study was conducted by a collaborator of ours in New Zealand at the time, now in the US. They used a model that is called shuttle box, and prior to that it was mainly used in animals, where you have two extreme conditions. In this case, they had subjects being in two different chambers. One chamber had 45 degrees Celsius and 10% relative humidity, so very dry, hot environment. And the other extreme condition, the other chamber, had 10 degrees Celsius and 50% relative humidity, so very hot, very cold and humid. And as you see, they were wearing minimal clothing, and they had the option of moving back and forth without standing, just by pressing a button. They could not get out of these two chambers for a considerable amount of time, and their only option was to move from one place to the other. And the authors wanted to see what made them make the decision to move from one place to the other. Here you see in this graph, this is their core temperature, so their temperature deep inside their body. And as you see, it didn't change very much. It stayed around 37, which is the normal. However, what changed excessively was the yellow, the red line, which is skin temperature. So when they entered the hot chamber, this is results from one subject, by the way, their skin temperature became really high, and at some point, which is illustrated here by the yellow triangles, they decided to switch to the cold chamber and vice versa. So what fluctuated a lot was skin temperature and not this. This made the authors to conclude that what makes us make decisions to change our thermal balance is skin temperature and not so much core temperature. To confirm this further, they ran a second equally interesting study. In this case, they wanted to see whether thermal versus non-thermal stimuli can affect our behavioral thermoregulation. And to do this, they used a cycling protocol, an exercise protocol, and they asked subjects to exercise at a very high intensity, whatever feels very high. So a subjective, very high intensity. And at that time also they were wearing a suit that you can see here with black, and this suit circulates very hot water in the inside surface, which is attached to the skin. So it was 55 degrees Celsius, so they were doing a very hard exercise, and at the same time they were feeling really hot because of that suit. And they had five conditions. Except the control condition, they had a condition where the subject's face were cooled through a fan. Another condition where there was known thermal face cooling with a menthol cream. Menthol, what does, essentially it activates the TRP ion channels that I mentioned before that have to do with feelings of cooling. Therefore, by using menthol, which is used in a lot of products in our everyday life, we feel cooled, but in fact, our skin temperature is exactly the same. It doesn't change. It just makes us feel cool. So they used this chemical cooling. They also, on another trial, they had the face of the subjects being heated by a fan that was blowing very hot air. And in a final condition, they had non-thermal face heating by applying a cream of capsaicin. So again, the capsaicin activates the TRP ion channels responsible for heat sensation. So therefore, again, in reality, temperature did not change, but the feeling of temperature, they felt really, really hot. So this is what the outcome was. This is the total work that the subjects completed. And as you can see, during the cooling, when the face was actually being cooled, and when they were feeling cold, but in fact the temperature was exactly the same, they produced the highest amount of work. There was no difference between control and the chemical called the capsaicin. And again, the same results, so that you can see that they exercised a lot less when they had the capsaicin cream. They exercised to an equal, when they were warmed, they exercised a lot less. When they, in the control condition, the capsaicin condition, they exercised a little bit more, but a lot more when they were cooled, and when they were also, with no significant difference, when they felt being cooled. This is what I mentioned before. So in the warming condition, their face was really hot, but in the control and in the two chemical heating and cooling conditions, the temperature was exactly the same. So the feeling was a lot different, but in reality, the face was in exactly the same temperature. And in the cooling, of course, condition, because we were blowing cold air, the temperature of the face was exactly the same. It was a lot lower. And as you can see, again, they felt really uncomfortable in the heating condition, and very well, or nearly comfortable, when they were either chemically cooled or actually being cooled with a cold air. So this led to the conclusion that facial temperature and thermal perception are capable modulators of behavioral thermoregulation at work. and that whether you actually physically cool someone or chemically cool someone does not make any difference. You can actually achieve the same result, at least for a certain amount of time. This led us to draw a working model of behavioral thermoregulation, which goes like this. When there's a heat exposure, this affects our skin temperature. This makes our skin temperature go up, which at some point it will start affecting our deep core temperature. When our skin temperature is rising, we start feeling uncomfortable. At the same time, we start vasodilate, so there's a lot of blood flow directed to the skin, and as a result there's a lot less blood flow to go to the working muscles. This produces a cardiovascular strain and a reduction in peak oxygen uptake. Both of these lead to increased perceived exertion, so we feel a lot more fatigued. And as a result, we reduce our intensity. So we start, if again I'm running a marathon or I'm working outside, I will actually think I actually have to reduce my intensity, and this is the reason why this happens. And this is why, as I mentioned before, at the end of the day, the perceived exertion is a thermobehavioral result. And again, through a negative feedback loop, this has a result. By reducing our work intensity, our metabolism goes down slowly, and therefore this has a reduction in our core temperature. And finally, I would like to conclude my talk today with a small part on the aging process. Aging affects a lot of functions in our body from a physiological and genetics and biology point of view, and among which is thermoregulation. It has major issues, it creates a lot of difficulties with thermoregulation. As the next speakers will certainly demonstrate, as we get older, mortality risk raises when the environment gets hotter. Here you see the mortality risk when the temperature, the ambient temperature changes from normal. So even for 1.5 degrees Celsius, there's in individuals above 65 years, the mortality rate is increased. And why is this important? As you know, the world is aging, especially the Western societies, and also everywhere, but this is primarily seen in Western societies. The population is aging. Here you see in the bars 2060, the percentage of different age groups, and the current, or at least 3 years ago, in 2013. So the pyramid is pushed upwards, so we will have a lot more older people in the next decade. So therefore, this is of prime importance. In addition to having a lot of older people, we will have a lot of older people actually working. This is changes in work percentages for different age groups from just in the next 10 years. And as you can see, there's a 75% increase in the people working above 65 years of age. And the younger actually people, there's actually a trend towards lesser numbers, smaller numbers. So more and more people will actually be working at a later age. And this is reflected in the pension legislation that actually that was just voted in the European Union in the last year. This is the mean retirement age during 2060 based on the current regulation. This is, in the blue you see the current, and then with red you see the 2060 anticipation. So we will actually be working a lot later in our lifetimes. And this is Greece here. And here you see the percent of workers aged above 50. So from all the workforce, right now about 53% are above 50, and as years go by, this will increase up to 70%. So therefore, there will be a lot of people who will be older and will actually be doing work, and a lot of that will be physical work. And what happens to these individuals? We've shown in several studies in our laboratory here, plus in our collaborators in Canada, that older adults they store a lot more heat, either when they're passive or resting, or when they're exercising. In this study, we showed that In a hot, dry environment, so with not a lot of humidity, there is a 60% increase in heat storage in individuals who are 65 compared to individuals who are 21 years old. If we add some humidity to that, this increase is less pronounced, but still it's 30% increase. So even when they're not working, individuals who are older, they store a lot more heat. They cannot actually, what happens with these individuals is that they have less of a sweat production. So evaporation doesn't work that well, and they cannot dissipate the heat that is being absorbed by their body during hot exposure. This was during rest. During exercise, what we've shown is that with the blue bars here, you see heat loss. And the dark ones are young and the light ones are older. You see that heat loss is much greater during exercise in younger individuals compared to older, either for men or for women, who are the orange and the brown bars. And as a result, and also whole body sweat rate is a lot higher in younger individuals, both in men and women. And as a result, core temperature is increased. So older individuals experienced greater levels of heat stress during exercise and during rest when the environment is hot. Some people were saying that, well, you know, in occupations where heat is an everyday exposure, is an everyday activity, such as firefighters, there will be acclimatization. People will be actually used to this, and as a result, when they're getting older, this will not have an effect. We recently showed that even in firefighters, if you compare firefighters with non-firefighters at the same age, the difference is more or less the same. The amount of heat that they store is the same as if they were not firefighters. And look at how low the heat storage, the cumulative heat storage, is for young firefighters here. So there's a 40 or 56% increase in a dry heat environment, and a little bit less in a humid hot environment compared to young firefighters. So whether you're working in the fields, for example, or you're a firefighter, it doesn't matter. As you get older, your body will be less capable of dissipating the excess heat through metabolism. And I will finish with just one study that we did recently, where we showed that there is a way to alleviate this, and the reason and the way is actually exercise and being aerobically fit. Here in this chart, you see with the circles, the blue and the red are, the blue are young individuals, the green are individuals who are older, middle-aged, but they're aerobically fit. They exercise regularly. And with the red and the purple, you see individuals who, in the red, they're older individuals, and in the purple are middle-aged who are unfit. And as you see that with competitive bouts of exercise, middle-aged individuals actually are at the same level of heat loss with young individuals. However, at the same age, people who are not fit, who are the purple here, they actually are able to dissipate a lot less of that heat. Therefore, as far as we know now, up to now, the only way to actually maintain our thermoregulatory system to a good working functionality or a good working rate is to exercise regularly. And maybe this is why this person is 147-year-old. Thank you very much for your attention.